A Sunday morning in March 2019. 23,000 empty seats stare back at a pastor who, just 18 months earlier, couldn't find parking for the overflow crowds. The Crystal Cathedral in Garden Grove, California, once a monument to American evangelical Christianity, broadcast into 40 million homes weekly, now belongs to the Catholic Church, sold for $57 million to cover debts. The founding pastor's daughter stands in the parking lot, weeping as moving trucks haul away her father's legacy. This isn't supposed to happen. Not in America, not in the Bible Belt, where megachurches rose like modern-day cathedrals, where pastors became celebrities, where Sunday attendance numbers climbed into the tens of thousands. For 40 years, these institutions seemed invincible, growing larger and wealthier with each passing decade. But something changed. Something fundamental shifted in the bedrock beneath these massive congregations, and now, across the American South and Heartland, these giants are falling. The collapse began so quietly that most people missed it entirely. In 2007, Prestonwood Baptist Church in Plano, Texas, was welcoming 45,000 members through its doors. Pastor Jack Graham stood at the pulpit of what was effectively a small city, complete with its own coffee shops, bookstores, even a recreation center that rivaled most community facilities. The Sunday services required professional traffic directors in the parking lots. The children's ministry alone employed over 300 volunteers. This was the apex of American megachurch culture, the fulfillment of a vision that began in the 1970s with a handful of entrepreneurial pastors who dared to imagine church differently. But by 2019, Prestonwood had lost nearly 12,000 members. The parking lots, once jam-packed, had vast empty sections cordoned off to save on maintenance costs. The bookstore closed. The coffee shop reduced its hours. And Pastor Graham found himself asking a question he never thought he'd face. What went wrong? He wasn't alone. Across the Bible Belt, the story repeated itself with eerie consistency. Mars Hill Church in Seattle, led by the charismatic Mark Driscoll, grew to 15 locations and 14,000 attendees, then imploded completely in 2014, closing every single campus. Harvest Bible Chapel in Chicago, boasting 13,000 members at its peak, saw senior pastor James McDonald removed in 2019 amid financial scandals, watching attendance plummet by 70% within months. In 2020, Willow Creek Community Church, once the model for the entire seeker-sensitive movement, with 25,000 regular attendees, saw its founding pastor, Bill Hybels, resign in disgrace, followed by his entire elder board and the subsequent senior pastor. Attendance cratered by 43%. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories that shaped our world and the moments that changed everything. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it where you are? Are you catching this during your morning commute, or maybe late at night when you can't sleep? Drop a comment and let me know. I'm genuinely curious about who's on the other side of these videos. The megachurch phenomenon didn't emerge from a vacuum. It grew from very specific soil, planted in very specific circumstances that made 1970s and 1980s America the perfect breeding ground for massive consumer-friendly religious experiences. In 1955, there were exactly 0 megachurches in America. If we define a megachurch as a Protestant congregation, averaging 2,000 or more attendees per week. 0. By 1970, there were 10. By 1990, that number had exploded to 250. By 2005, more than 1,200 megachurches dotted the American landscape, with the vast majority concentrated in the Sun Belt states: Texas, California, Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee. The first true megachurch architect was Robert Schuller, the man behind that doomed Crystal Cathedral. Schuller started in 1955 by preaching from the roof of a snack bar at a drive-in movie theater in Orange County, California. He discovered something profound. Americans would come to church if you made it convenient, entertaining, and emotionally uplifting. Remove the guilt, add parking, throw in some professional quality music, and suddenly you had a product people actually wanted to consume on Sunday mornings. By 1980, Schuller had built his glass cathedral, a architectural marvel designed by Philip Johnson, featuring over 10,000 panes of reflective glass and seating for nearly 3,000 people. His Hour of Power television broadcast reached more viewers than any religious program in history, except Billy Graham's Crusades. The formula worked. Remove traditional hymns, add a orchestra and professional choir, preach about possibility thinking instead of sin and damnation, and create a space so beautiful that attending felt like a privilege rather than an obligation. Other pastors took notes. Bill Hybels founded Willow Creek in 1975 with a radical idea: survey the unchurched people in your community and ask them what they want. The responses were consistent. They wanted better music, shorter sermons, casual dress codes, and messages focused on practical life application rather than theological abstraction. Hybels delivered exactly that, and within a decade, Willow Creek was averaging 15,000 attendees per weekend across multiple services. Rick Warren took similar principles to Southern California, founding Saddleback Church in 1980. His purpose-driven model became a blueprint copied by thousands of churches worldwide. Warren surveyed his community and discovered that people wanted relevant teaching, contemporary music, and an atmosphere that felt more like a concert venue than a traditional sanctuary. He gave them all three plus small groups, marriage seminars, financial planning courses, and recovery programs. By the mid-1990s, Saddleback was averaging 20,000 attendees weekly. The business model was brilliant in its simplicity. Create a high-quality Sunday experience that competed with every other entertainment option available. Invest heavily in facilities: sound systems, lighting, comfortable seating, climate control, children's areas with professional childcare. Hire staff with actual expertise: worship leaders who could have toured professionally, communications directors with broadcast experience, financial officers with real business credentials. Market aggressively using the same techniques as any consumer brand. And most importantly, grow. Always grow. A megachurch that wasn't getting bigger was, by definition, dying. The entire operational model depended on a continuous influx of new attendees and their tithing dollars to service the massive overhead costs. For 30 years, this model worked spectacularly well. Real estate values climbed, making church property increasingly valuable. The baby boom generation, aging into their peak earning years, had disposable income and a lingering cultural connection to Christianity that made them receptive to these updated religious experiences. Media technology, first radio, then television, then internet streaming, allowed charismatic pastors to extend their reach far beyond their physical campuses, building national and even international brands. The economics were staggering. By 2006, the 1,200 American megachurches collectively took in over $7 billion annually. The largest among them operated on budgets that dwarfed small corporations. Joel Osteen's Lakewood Church in Houston reported annual revenues exceeding $70 million. T.D. Jakes' Potter's House in Dallas brought in over $50 million. These weren't churches in the traditional sense. They were religious entertainment complexes with marketing budgets, human resources departments, and capital expansion plans that required teams of lawyers and accountants. But the seeds of collapse were already germinating, hidden beneath the surface of all that apparent success. The first crack appeared in the form of scandal, and it followed a pattern that would become grimly familiar. Ted Haggard, president of the National Association of Evangelicals and founding pastor of New Life Church in Colorado Springs, 14,000 members strong, fell in 2006 when a male escort revealed their ongoing relationship. The church survived but lost nearly 30% of its congregation within a year. These weren't isolated incidents. Between 2007 and 2020, more than 50 megachurch pastors faced serious allegations ranging from financial mismanagement to sexual misconduct to spiritual abuse. What made these cases particularly damaging wasn't just the moral failure. Traditional churches had always weathered pastoral scandals. The difference was structural. In a traditional denominational church, a fallen pastor could be removed and replaced because the institution existed independently of any individual leader. But megachurches, by design, were built around the personality and charisma of their founding pastor. The entire brand was inextricably tied to one person. When that person fell, the brand fell with them. Members who'd been attracted to Mark Driscoll's edgy, masculine Christianity didn't want a different pastor delivering a softer version of the same message. They wanted Mark Driscoll, and when he was gone, they left. Mars Hill Church offers the most dramatic example. At its 2013 peak, the church operated 15 campuses across 5 states, with over 14,000 attendees and annual revenues approaching $50 million. Mark Driscoll's aggressive, confrontational style had built an empire. He preached about biblical manhood, railed against what he saw as the feminization of American Christianity, and created a culture of unquestioning loyalty among his staff and elders. But former members began sharing stories. Driscoll's leadership style wasn't just aggressive, it was allegedly abusive. Staff members described a culture of fear, with Driscoll publicly humiliating employees, demanding absolute obedience, and retaliating against anyone who questioned his decisions. In 2014, evidence emerged that Driscoll had used church funds to manipulate his book onto the New York Times bestseller list, essentially buying his own success. The executive elders launched an investigation. Within 4 months, every single Mars Hill campus had closed. 14,000 members scattered. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs. The buildings were sold off to cover debts. A church that had seemed invincible in 2013 literally ceased to exist by early 2015. And here's the crucial detail. Most of those 14,000 members didn't find new churches. They simply stopped attending altogether. By the way, if you're getting value from this deep dive into a story most media outlets won't touch, consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely helps us keep making content that goes beyond the headlines and into the real complexities of the world we live in. But even if you can't, sharing this video makes a massive difference. The second crack came from an unexpected direction: the children of megachurch members. Millennials and Gen Z, raised in these massive congregational environments, began walking away in unprecedented numbers. Research from the Pew Research Center, published in 2019, revealed that 36% of Americans born between 1981 and 1996 claimed no religious affiliation, nearly triple the rate of their parents' generation at the same age. Among those who'd been raised in megachurches specifically, the departure rate was even higher. Why? The answers gathered from hundreds of exit interviews and surveys were surprisingly consistent. Many young adults described their megachurch upbringing as emotionally manipulative, high on entertainment value and emotional experiences, but low on genuine community and theological depth. They'd been raised in children's and youth programs that looked more like Christian-themed entertainment than spiritual formation, with laser tag events, rock climbing walls, and weekend retreats to luxury camps. One former megachurch member, interviewed by the Hartford Institute for Religion Research, put it this way: "I grew up thinking church was supposed to be this amazing experience every single week, like going to a concert where you cry and feel really close to God. But when I got to college and actually started dealing with hard questions about faith and life, I realized I'd been given cotton candy. Sweet and fun, but no actual nutrition. I didn't know how to pray without a backing band. I didn't know what I believed beyond Jesus loves me and has a wonderful plan for my life. And when that wonderful plan included depression, a failed relationship, and student debt, I didn't have any framework for making sense of it." This sentiment echoed across thousands of similar testimonies. The megachurch model, optimized for creating powerful emotional experiences and steady growth, had apparently failed at the most fundamental task of any religious institution: transmitting the faith to the next generation in a form resilient enough to survive real-world challenges. But the killing blow came from a source no pastor anticipated: the smartphone. In 2007, the iPhone launched, and within 5 years, smartphones had become ubiquitous in American life. This technological shift fundamentally altered how people consumed content, built community, and allocated their attention. And it absolutely devastated the megachurch model. Think about what made megachurches work in the 1980s and 1990s. If you wanted to hear a dynamic, entertaining preacher deliver a compelling message, you had to physically show up. If you wanted professional quality worship music, you had to attend the service. If you wanted to connect with other believers, you had to participate in church activities. There was no alternative. The megachurch was your only access point to these experiences. By 2015, all of that had changed. You could watch Joel Osteen, T.D. Jakes, Stephen Furtick, or any of 1,000 other compelling preachers on your phone, in your pajamas, without fighting traffic or finding childcare. You could stream worship music from Hillsong or Bethel Music anytime you wanted. You could join online communities of believers from around the world, discussing theology and sharing prayer requests on Facebook groups, Reddit forums, or specialized apps. The convenience that had been the megachurch's greatest competitive advantage in the pre-internet era became irrelevant. Why drive 40 minutes, find parking, and sit through announcements and offering appeals when you could get the same content? Often better content from multiple sources without leaving your couch? The data reflects this shift with brutal clarity. Between 2007 and 2020, overall church attendance in America dropped by 23%. But for churches over 2,000 attendees, the decline was steeper, 31%. The very largest churches, those over 10,000 attendees, saw an average decline of 38%. Smaller churches, particularly those under 200 members, actually held steady or even grew slightly during the same period. What happened? The megachurches had been drawing attendees from a radius of 20 or 30 miles, people willing to make the commute because the experience was worth it. But once technology removed the scarcity of high-quality religious content, the commute became a barrier rather than an acceptable trade-off. Meanwhile, small local churches retained members who valued genuine relationships and geographic proximity over production value. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated this collapse exponentially. When churches were forced to move services online in March 2020, megachurches discovered a terrifying reality. Their expensive facilities, professional staff, and massive overhead costs provided no advantage in a digital environment. In fact, they became liabilities. Gateway Church in Southlake, Texas, had invested over $120 million in facilities by 2019. When the pandemic hit, all those buildings sat empty while the church hemorrhaged money on maintenance, utilities, and debt service. Meanwhile, the church's online services competed not just with other local churches, but with literally every religious content creator on the internet. Why watch Gateway's stream when you could watch a more polished production from Elevation Church, or a more theologically rich teaching from the Village Church, or a more emotionally engaging worship service from Passion City Church? Between March 2020 and December 2021, Gateway Church lost over 40% of its in-person attendance. When people finally did return to physical services, they didn't come back at previous levels. By late 2022, Gateway was averaging around 12,000 weekend attendees, down from over 21,000 pre-pandemic. The financial pressure became crushing. Staff layoffs followed, then program cuts, then deferred maintenance on facilities that were already beginning to show their age. And Gateway was one of the better-off megachurches. Others faced far worse. Highlands Church in Birmingham, Alabama, averaging over 20,000 attendees pre-pandemic, saw attendance drop to around 11,000 by 2023 and continues to decline. Christ Fellowship in Miami, once boasting 35,000 weekend attendees, fell to approximately 19,000. The Village Church in Texas, which had grown to 11,000 attendees by 2019, dropped to around 7,000 by 2023, despite being led by Matt Chandler, one of the most respected voices in evangelical Christianity. But here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn. The collapse isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. In January 2024, Gateway Church, that same Texas megachurch that had already lost 40% of its attendance, faced a new crisis when founding pastor Robert Morris was accused of sexually abusing a 12-year-old girl in the 1980s. The allegations, which Morris eventually acknowledged, led to his immediate resignation. Within 6 months, Gateway lost an additional 35% of its remaining congregation. The church that had once welcomed over 20,000 people weekly now struggles to reach 5,000. Hillsong Church, the Australian megachurch network that had expanded to locations across multiple continents with a combined attendance exceeding 150,000, completely collapsed between 2020 and 2024. Founding pastor Brian Houston resigned in 2022 amid scandal. The entire United States operation shut down, closing all campuses. The Phoenix campus became a furniture store. The buildings in Boston and New Jersey were sold. By mid-2024, only a handful of international locations remained open, operating at a fraction of their former size. What's particularly striking about these recent collapses is how quickly they happen. Mars Hill took about 4 months to completely implode. Hillsong's American operations went from robust to extinct in under 2 years. The Crystal Cathedral, despite its long history and iconic status, went from financially stable to bankrupt to sold in less than 3 years. Traditional church closures happen gradually, over decades, as congregations slowly age and dwindle. Megachurch collapses happen catastrophically, like building demolitions. Everything is fine until suddenly it all comes down at once. And the reason has everything to do with their business model. Megachurches require enormous cash flow to survive. The Crystal Cathedral at its peak needed over $5 million per month just to keep the lights on and meet basic obligations. When attendance drops by 20 or 30%, revenue drops proportionally, but expenses don't. You still have mortgages on buildings sized for your peak attendance. You still have staff contracts, utility bills, insurance premiums, maintenance costs. The math stops working almost immediately. Smaller churches can weather attendance decline because their expenses scale down more easily. A traditional church of 200 members might be able to get by with a part-time pastor and volunteer staff. But a megachurch with a $50 million annual budget can't simply downsize to $25 million without fundamentally ceasing to be what it was. The production quality drops, the programs get cut, the staff departures create gaps, and the whole value proposition that attracted people in the first place disappears. This creates a death spiral. Declining attendance leads to budget cuts, which leads to reduced quality and fewer programs, which leads to more people leaving, which leads to deeper budget cuts, and so on, until the entire operation becomes unsustainable and shuts down completely. Now here's what almost nobody in the media is talking about. Where are all these people going? You might assume they're finding smaller, more traditional churches. Some are, but most aren't. Research from the Barna Group, published in 2023, tracked former megachurch attendees and found that approximately 68% either stopped attending church altogether or became what researchers call irregular attenders, showing up less than once per month. These aren't people who've lost their faith necessarily. Many still identify as Christian. They still pray, read the Bible, listen to Christian podcasts or music. They've just decoupled those spiritual practices from institutional church attendance. One researcher termed this phenomenon digital discipleship, people constructing their own religious experience from online content, social media communities, and occasional in-person gatherings that look nothing like traditional church services. This represents something unprecedented in American religious history. Previous declines in church attendance, like the one that hit mainline Protestant denominations in the 1960s and 70s, saw people moving from liberal churches to conservative ones, or from one denomination to another. But they stayed within the institutional structure of organized religion. What's happening now is different. People aren't switching churches. They're abandoning the entire concept of regular institutional church attendance while maintaining some form of personalized spirituality. And once that shift happens, it appears to be largely irreversible. Follow-up studies tracking these dechurched Americans show that less than 8% eventually return to regular attendance. For megachurch pastors who built their entire lives around growing large congregations, this reality is devastating. Joel Osteen, whose Lakewood Church in Houston averaged over 43,000 attendees in 2019, now sees around 27,000. a 37% decline. T.D. Jakes' Potter's House, which peaked at over 30,000, now averages around 18,000. These men are watching their life's work shrink before their eyes, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. Some have tried to adapt. Andy Stanley, whose North Point Community Church in Atlanta once drew over 40,000 attendees weekly, has attempted to pivot toward a hybrid model, investing heavily in online content and small group connections rather than just Sunday services. It's slowed the decline. North Point is down to around 32,000, but hasn't reversed it. Others have doubled down on the old model, insisting that the solution is even better production values, even more compelling experiences, even stronger marketing. Elevation Church in Charlotte, led by Stephen Furtick, has taken this approach, spending millions on concert-level stage production, professional lighting, and stadium-style venues. It's kept their numbers relatively stable at around 25,000 weekly attendees, for now. But it's also put them in massive debt and made them even more dependent on continuous growth to service those obligations. A few pastors have acknowledged that the megachurch era might simply be ending. Francis Chan, who founded Cornerstone Church in Simi Valley, California, growing it to over 5,000 attendees, walked away in 2010, telling his congregation that he worried the church had become more about the experience than about genuine discipleship. He moved to San Francisco to plant house churches focused on simple community and radical obedience to Jesus' teachings, serving the poor and living among the marginalized. Chan's decision was widely praised in some circles and derided in others as irresponsible, abandoning a successful ministry for a romantic but impractical vision. But in hindsight, he may have been ahead of his time, recognizing that the model was fundamentally broken before the data made it obvious to everyone else. The financial implications of this collapse extend far beyond the churches themselves. Megachurches became major economic engines in their communities. Gateway Church employed over 800 people at its peak. That's 800 families dependent on those salaries. When the church cut staff by 60%, it didn't just impact those employees, it rippled through the entire local economy. The restaurants near the church campus lost Sunday lunch crowds. The Christian bookstores that relied on church members for business shut down. The contractors who maintained the facilities lost major accounts. Multiply that pattern across hundreds of declining megachurches nationwide, and you're looking at tens of thousands of lost jobs and billions in reduced economic activity. Communities that planned their infrastructure around megachurch attendance, building roads, retail spaces, and services to accommodate the Sunday crowds, now have excess capacity and declining tax revenue. Real estate presents another looming crisis. What do you do with a building designed to hold 10,000 people when you can only attract 2,000? You can't easily repurpose a massive worship center into something else. Unlike a shopping mall that can be converted into office space or a factory that can be redeveloped, these purpose-built church facilities are nearly worthless on the open market. The Crystal Cathedral sold for $57 million, about $43 million less than it cost to build, even accounting for inflation. And that was to the Catholic Diocese of Orange, one of the few organizations with both the money and the motivation to buy a church building. Most megachurch properties won't find such buyers. They'll either sit vacant, deteriorating into eyesores, or be demolished, taking with them hundreds of millions in construction costs that will never be recovered. Some vacant megachurch properties have found unlikely second lives. The former Lakeland, Florida, megachurch campus now houses a trampoline park. A Nashville megachurch building became a furniture store. The Phoenix Hillsong campus is now an event venue and gym. But these conversions are exceptions. Most communities don't have a use for buildings this large and architecturally specialized. Perhaps the most profound question is what this collapse means for American Christianity more broadly. Megachurches, for all their flaws, were doing one thing extremely well: attracting people who otherwise wouldn't attend church. They brought in thousands of Americans who found traditional churches boring, irrelevant, or unwelcoming. Whatever you think of their theology or methods, megachurches were genuinely effective at engagement,